Hi guys, Mr. Ridgway here, and today we're going to talk about a super cheery subject, the Great Depression. So on that happy note, let's get started. So what we're going to be looking at here in this lesson is the causes for the Great Depression, and also the response of the president at the time, that was President Hoover, and how that's probably, from our understandings that we've had before about Hoover, at least in historians, what you probably heard, maybe have heard about him, is probably a little bit different than you might expect. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, because we are going to be discussing how Hoover maybe did more kind of in context than anybody else. Beforehand, we're going to talk about how does perception and hindsight affect our understanding of history, both in terms of people and events. Okay, so now that we, in the year 2018, looking back at the financial recession in 2007, 2008, there have been, I guess, more kind of people who focused upon the Great Depression in terms of looking at that from parallels to today. So we will have to be really, really careful about how we perceive the Great Depression, because we want to make sure that the number one thing is that we're understanding it from our context. Okay, so the Great Depression. Let's talk about the traditional narrative that most people seem to have about it. Okay. Many people assume the Great Depression went something like this. A majority of Americans owned stocks before the great crash of the stock market in October 1929. And then all of a sudden, this massive crash happens on Wall Street. And all of a sudden, the entire economy tanks, and we go into the Great Depression. And then once we get to that point, we have the Hoovervilles, which are named after this president that did nothing. And as you might expect, the traditional narrative that we have with this is actually a lot more complicated than this. And in some ways, it's just wrong when viewed from a more kind of comparative context. So check out this source here before you go on. It's a video with John Green, just for those of you who are following along with the lesson in the slides. Okay, so what actually did happen? Well, again, we're going to kind of back up here a little bit because we need to kind of set the stage. So when President Hoover is elected, in 1928, he's immensely popular at the time, for he crushes the Electoral College, 444 electoral votes to his rival, who only got 87. The thing is, though, is that, let's just deal with the stock market beforehand, because that seems to be a big issue that a lot of people talk about. Only roughly about 2.5% of Americans own stocks when the actual crash happened. So if the crash doesn't cause the Great Depression, because if we're saying that, the Great Depression is affecting everybody, then we really need to separate those two events entirely, and we're going to go ahead and do that. Now, let's talk about Hoover. Hoover actually, when viewed from context, promoted more government intervention in the economy than any president beforehand. But he's also dealing with the struggle of should the government intervene more than it ever has? But then does that mean he's breaking the principles of laissez-faire and that the government should stay out of everyday businesses and those kind of people's lives? And also, it's not and this is kind of also an important thing to remember about timing, when the stock market crash happens and then about a year or so in, when the Depression really is going, it takes about 3 years to really get super depressing. But it does start as far back into the 1920s, and we'll talk about some of that stagnation here in just a second. Okay, so what are the actual crashes? Okay, so the first one, or the first thing I would tell you is to try to memorize this acronym SPACED, because acronyms are easy and they help, memorizing become a less burdensome task. So, S, stagnation and oversaturation. Okay, so when you guys go on and study economics as a senior, something you'll learn about is that there is a point in which the economy can become oversaturated. People can only own so many houses, so many cars, and there's nobody has an unlimited amount of garage that they can store these things. And so as people are starting to become, in the 1920s, and the economy's been really good, they're starting to have all these things in life they're enjoying. There does hit a point of kind of diminished returns in terms of people being able to buy new products. And so we see cars and housing, those two areas of demand, they really start to decrease because people simply can't buy anymore. And then over in agricultural areas, the United States after World War I had actually been supplying most of the crops to the world. And as U.S. farmers have been producing at these extremely high levels and then shipping that food out to the world because nobody else is growing anything. Europe is starting to catch back up in the 1920s because they're starting to regrow their economies after World War One. Farmers are starting to farm again, and all of a sudden we have so many agricultural products that are out there that the price just absolutely tanks, which is always bad for farmers. Okay, now let's talk about things related to Wall Street. But again, we know that the crash doesn't cause the depression because we can separate those two things. Okay, panic raised by the crash. Now, kind of related to the crash, but kind of aside. So a big thing of economics is perception. If people perceive that the economy is falling apart, people are going to start to see the economy fall apart because people have to literally, no pun intended, buy into the economy working. So if all of a sudden people start panicking and they think that the economy is falling apart, they're going to stop buying, and that's really, really bad. And this kind of goes down here to C, where it's this collapse of confidence. If people stop buying and selling, literally the economy stops, because that's how a market economy works. It's a place where people buy and sell products, and if that grinds to a halt, your economy collapses. Okay. A, abuses on Wall Street. So Wall Street in the 1920s had also reached this level of like mass optimism where they just keep, buying and buying and buying stock, and it just keeps going up and up and up and up and up, and people like just literally believe that it will never stop getting better. And what becomes very, very popular is they do something called at margin buying, which is like they would take out essentially, which is simplifying a really complicated subject, loans to then buy a stock and then would then resell that stock at a certain price depending on how it went up or down. And so what happens then is that if they sense that their stock is going down too much, they have this kind of like very short-term tunnel vision where they will just instantly sell off as soon as possible if they see things start to collapse. So again, kind of you can see this is not setting us up for success here. Economics. Okay, let's talk about the economic system in the United States at this time. Okay, so banks do not have literally the tools to help a falling economy at this time. Okay, so there is a Federal Reserve System that's been in place since Woodrow Wilson was in office, but things like the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission. So if you put like all of your savings in a bank, there's no guarantee that the government is going to give you those savings back if the bank closes. And so all these support systems that were supposed to exist for the United States economy, and they do exist now, don't exist then. Okay, so the banks aren't literally ready to help when the economy stops. Okay, and then the last one is the one I'm about to talk about here on the next slide, which is the Dawes Plan, and that falls apart. So let's go ahead and look here at this overseas lending thing that happens with Europe. Okay, so this is kind of, this chart over here is kind of talking about the vicious circle of a depression. And this is a really, really cool, basically graph that I stole from a book called The Great Depression Over in Europe, but it basically explains how a depression happens. So whether or not you start at any circle, it really doesn't matter, but notice that all the circles end up in a collapse of confidence, because again, that's what I said will crush any kind of economy. Okay, but let's talk about the Dawes Plan specifically, because that's probably something most people aren't familiar with. So after World War I, there was a system of war reparations set up. Okay, because if you're not too familiar with World War I, you haven't taken a world history course, Germany is essentially blamed for causing World War I, which totally breaks my German heart. Okay, however, what they have to do then is they have to make war reparations to pay France, Britain, and really all of Europe for the damages that they cause. Now, where Germany gets this money to pay back these war reparations are from loans from the US. So the US will loan Germany money, Germany will then pay back Britain, France, and Europe, and then what will happen is that for also loans that were taken out during World War I, Britain, France, and Europe will pay that money back to the US. And this cycle that is working really, really well after World War I stops when the US economy stops. And all of a sudden we get this massive chain reaction, and the Great Depression becomes much more globalized than simply a US event. Okay, cool. So let's talk about Hoover. What does he do? I'm kind of shifting tacks here now. We're gonna say yes, the Great Depression's happening. Hoover starts to see things. So what does he do? Herbert Hoover had a vast amount of experience with government planning of how to help people in a depression. He was a big data guy. He was really the guy that led, as it says here, the food relief efforts for Belgium during World War I. This is a guy who knows how to plan relief efforts, and to do so with kind of like big thinking in mind. Herbert Hoover also importantly sees himself as a progressive, like the progressives we talked about before in previous videos. And his big principle here is that he wants to save the economy through something called volunteerism, because even though he is a progressive and he wants intervention to happen, he doesn't want to overstep that, and that's kind of what this last point says. He wants to promote volunteerism, that the government is going to encourage people, businesses to step up and cooperate to help out others, and he's going to encourage as many businesses to do this as possible, but he can't do it to the point where he breaks the U.S. culture of laissez-faire, where the government stays out of the economy. And that's what Hoover, he was called the great engineer, is really going to struggle with in this upcoming crisis. Okay, so what does Hoover do? And his attempts are extremely bold. And our little bullet points here, noted with a Hoover vacuum, are examples of this government-stimulated voluntary cooperation, where the government's going to encourage businesses to try to do their part to stop the depression from happening, essentially. So let's talk about three things first here, and then we'll kind of go on to beyond volunteerism. So there's the Agricultural Marketing Act. So this is where the government will promote cooperatives, stabilization corporations to buy excess agricultural products that are out there to try to raise those prices back up for farmers. Hoover has like 2 straight, basically weeks of meetings with industry leaders to try to encourage them to keep hiring workers, to keep selling products, keep buying things, keep making big investments. And he also doubles federal public work expenditure in 3 years. Like, he is again, going after this pretty actively. And he eventually does even break his rule. He does go beyond laissez-faire and his rules of volunteerism. And the greatest example we have of this is something called the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And this is something that was actually very similarly done back in 2007, 2008, when the U.S. auto industry started to fail. And what it does is, and what it did is, Hoover basically makes public dollars, so again, this is like bank money from the U.S. Treasury, essentially, available to lend to private banks. So think of it this way: you are essentially bailing out private businesses with U.S. government money, and that was something that had never ever been done before, and also pretty obviously breaks the whole rule of like the U.S. government getting intervening, putting their fingers into private industry and private ventures, especially with capital. Okay. However, despite his efforts, he can't fix the depression, and this is where I'll briefly describe this. And there's also some pictures down here you can check out to see what, kind of what it looked like for Americans to be in the depression. But again, for everything that Hoover does, all of his attempts eventually are exhausted. Even despite abandoning his principles of volunteerism, he still loses in terms of the one-man effort to do so. Thousands of bank closes happen all across the United States. These closings also basically mean that all people's savings are lost. So like when the bank had invested, for example, your money on the stock market, not only was that money lost, but then when the bank also couldn't generate savings when people make a run on the banks, and there's no money for them to lend out, or to give back from your money that you had stored there, your savings are just gone. Roughly about 20% of the labor force is unemployed. In cities, the average is roughly about 50%. So for farmers, it was still okay, obviously still terrible, but compared to cities, it was better. Wages get cut, hours get cut. There's also no unemployment insurance at this time, so people receiving a wage while they're unemployed and looking for a job doesn't exist. For minorities, and there's been some really good studies that have been done into this recently, for minorities in the Depression, it's even rougher. So imagine higher unemployment, little to no access to wages, etc. And as we'll get to talk about more next class, Americans are just literally uprooted from their lives because of this event. We'll talk about next class about the Dust Bowl and more people heading west to seek refuge from that quite dusty experience. So, on that happy note, that's the end of our thing, at the end of our presentation here on the Great Depression. Don't forget to complete your exit ticket, and also, just as a word to the wise, because I want to make sure this is in here, please be aware that as we head towards the end of the semester, you need to make sure that you are keenly keeping up with long-term planning, because we have not only our in-class homework that we need to be doing. Only yesterday, chapter 3 and 4 are pretty long, and so you want to make sure you're not getting too behind on that. Especially because I'm using the million only yesterday. We're going to have a project that I'll come together into. We also are going to have a midterm before spring break. And please, 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 please make sure you start studying for it now. We've covered so much stuff since spring break, and that's a test you definitely want to do well on. Okay, so in essence, stay organized, keep working hard, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.